John Grant stepped off the military transport plane onto the compacted snow of the remote Alaskan airstrip. The year was 1998, and the cold wind stung his face despite the heavy jacket he wore. He was a major in the Army Corps of Engineers, assigned to a classified project that few people would ever learn about. Surrounding him were members of his specialized team, each an expert in subterranean construction and secrecy. Their mission involved creating an underground tunnel for a newly formed hidden base, built under orders from authorities who had no intention of revealing its existence. He walked toward the waiting half-track vehicles, scanning the unfamiliar terrain. Sub-zero temperatures pressed down on the group, but John focused on the task. He had 7 months to complete the tunnel. Any delay threatened the viability of the entire operation. His orders were clear: finish before the harshest season took hold. The environment here was unforgiving, and the mission demanded results. Several enlisted personnel stood by, offering quick salutes. One of them, a young private, directed John and his companions into the vehicles for the drive to the base site. Along the route, John observed endless expanses of ice, faint outlines of pine forests, and the occasional silhouette of a distant peak. The track was uneven, and the vehicles lurched with every bump. Nobody complained. Finally, they arrived at the temporary compound. A cluster of large, insulated tents replaced the usual barracks, since construction of permanent buildings was still incomplete. Workers and soldiers coexisted under cramped conditions, each bound by non-disclosure agreements. John felt the tension among them. He saw exhaustion in their stoic faces, a sign that this location had demanded grueling dedication from the beginning. Waiting in front of the largest tent was Henry, the man designated as station chief. Henry greeted John and his team with a firm handshake. His voice had an undercurrent of urgency, and he wasted no time. He led John inside, where a portable heater hummed in a corner. The heat barely took the chill off. Stacks of documents and geological maps covered a small folding table. Henry talked about the essential tasks. The base's main objective was the extraction of a volatile substance hidden deep beneath the permafrost. According to Henry, this material degraded quickly and required immediate removal. John's construction expertise was the cornerstone of completing the underground passage needed to transport the substance away. John nodded, studying the maps. He recognized the geological complexities. The soil composition was unpredictable. The presence of shifting ice made stability questionable. Henry emphasized that time was limited, and that success depended on unbroken focus. Shortly afterward, Bradley, the head scientist, joined them. His tone was more relaxed, yet his eyes held sharp intelligence. He introduced himself and handed John a folder detailing the properties of the substance they sought. It emitted dangerous fumes if exposed to open air for too long. Bradley confessed he was fascinated by the discovery, even though it had originated on land considered sacred by local legends. He mentioned old tales passed down through certain tribes, warning outsiders to leave the ground undisturbed. He stated that superstitions claimed these lands were under the protection of ancient guardians. John listened politely but felt skeptical. He had served in places where folklore and rumors thrived, especially near remote facilities. In his mind, local myths rarely influenced the outcome of scientific endeavors. He allowed Bradley to speak without interruption, though he remained unconvinced of any supernatural threat. Henry reiterated the importance of building the tunnel swiftly. Each day lost risked contamination of the raw material, compromising the entire project. John requested a quick tour of the excavation area at dawn. He wanted to see the initial site where his team would begin drilling. Henry agreed, then suggested they rest for the night. Outside, John's breath formed small clouds in the cold air. He walked past rows of tents, nodding at the other personnel huddled around portable heaters. Lights flickered along improvised walkways. Soon John reached his assigned tent, marked with a simple sign. Inside, he settled onto a cot, laid out his notes, and contemplated the next steps. 7 months could vanish quickly under these harsh conditions. He needed a solid plan to ensure no setbacks threatened his schedule. He tried to sleep, despite the wind whipping the tent. Tomorrow, he would witness the excavation zone and finalize construction strategies. For now, he felt the weight of the mission. Success meant fulfilling his duty. The morning began with a shrill alarm echoing across the snowy camp. John Grant emerged from his tent, alarmed by the frantic voices carrying through the cold air. Soldiers hurried toward a smaller tent, shouting for a medic. John ran to follow, fearing the worst. Inside, he saw his longtime friend, Captain Mark Davidson, lying still on a blood-stained cot. Mark's uniform was torn and his chest bore deep gashes. A medical officer performed brief examinations, then shook his head grimly. John felt stunned by the sudden loss. He had served alongside Mark in multiple missions, trusting his expertise and calm under pressure. Now that steadfast colleague was gone. Henry entered, his expression grave. He spoke quietly. "We found tracks. Something came in last night and attacked while he slept." John searched the interior of the tent. Shredded fabric and scattered supplies suggested a powerful intruder. Bloodstains on the ground confirmed the violence. Outside, soldiers combed the frozen perimeter. One pointed to a large set of prints pressed into the snow. John crouched beside them. They appeared bigger than standard wolf tracks he remembered from his youth. His father had taught him how to differentiate various animal footprints. These were too wide, with claw marks that cut deeper into the crust. Still, Henry insisted wolves sometimes grew larger in these northern regions. John stood and turned to the assembled men. "I want to track this thing," he said firmly. Henry authorized a small patrol, hoping to kill the predator before it struck again. John accompanied 4 soldiers, each armed with rifles. They trudged across the snowy expanse, following the prints until a rocky slope forced them to reconsider. The tracks vanished near an outcropping of ice-crusted rock. A soldier scanned the horizon with binoculars, but reported no movement. Disheartened, they returned to the base. On arrival, John met Bradley outside the research tent. The scientist spoke in a low tone. "I heard about Mark. I'm sorry. There's concern among the civilian workers. They believe these wolves are more aggressive than ordinary predators." John nodded grimly. He shared their worries. That evening, John insisted on placing traps around the perimeter. He needed vengeance and some measure of prevention. Soldiers set tripwire alarms and steel jaw traps at likely approaches. The wind picked up, carrying the sound of distant howls. John tried to steady his breathing. He recalled Mark's laughter during lighter moments of past deployments. That memory fueled his determination. Night fell, and the base lights dimmed. Around midnight, the tripwire alarms blared. John rushed outside, rifle ready. Other soldiers converged on the same location. They found 2 wolves snarling in the darkness. The animals appeared lean, with coarse fur and unusually tall frames. John and his companions fired, dropping both beasts in a barrage of bullets. The camp grew silent again. At dawn, John examined the carcasses. They matched the size of typical wolves, though they seemed slightly stronger in build. Still, something felt off. John allowed the disposal team to haul them away and reported to Henry. "I hope we got the right ones," John said plainly. Henry sighed and looked anxious. "We can't be certain," Henry replied. "Security will remain on high alert." Over the next few days, new attacks occurred with chilling frequency. Wolves prowled close to tents at dusk. Sometimes, watchmen fired warning shots to drive them away. In one incident, they found fresh footprints near the storage area, though no casualties resulted that time. Unease gripped the camp. A dawn patrol encountered the remains of 2 workers near a shallow ravine. Tracks indicated an entire pack had surrounded them. Whoever died had little chance of escape. When John heard the report, he felt the grim reality settling in. The wolves seemed emboldened, hunting at will, showing no fear of armed patrols. The suspicion that these were no ordinary animals began to take root. Some civilians whispered strange stories about wolves that walked upright. John refused to indulge such talk openly, but he could not ignore the anxiety spreading through the workforce. One evening, Bradley approached John outside the mess tent. His tone was tense. "I'm running out of excuses for our staff. They're terrified." John responded, "We'll reinforce our defensive lines and continue hunting the pack. Once we eliminate them, everyone can work safely." Bradley nodded, though worry creased his features. That night, more gunshots rang out. The wolves launched another raid, circling sentries. The men drove them off. The dread remained. Rumors spread quickly among the workers and soldiers. People whispered about footprints too large to belong to ordinary wolves. Others repeated stories of a fleeting shape moving upright before dropping to all fours. John heard these accounts and questioned whether local folklore was influencing frightened minds. Yet, evidence on the ground suggested they faced a predator unlike anything known in textbooks. Daytime attacks began catching everyone off guard. The wolves once struck near midday while a maintenance crew repaired generators behind the research tent. 2 men were dragged away before armed guards could respond. Their remains were found half a mile from the base, torn apart. This brazenness led John to reconsider his strategy. He convened a brief meeting with Bradley and a few other personnel. "These animals show no fear," John said. "Our traps and alarms slow them, but they adapt. We need more advanced measures." Bradley agreed, though his expression hinted at deeper concerns. He mentioned local beliefs describing the region's guardians, ancient wolves tied to sacred land. The scientists present looked skeptical. John felt uncertain but pressed Bradley for details. Bradley explained that tribal legends warned outsiders to avoid digging too deeply here. Later, John stepped outside. He witnessed a construction crew hauling supplies for the tunnel project. Morale sagged, but people struggled on, knowing the mission could not stop. John approached a group of workers who murmured about monstrous wolves. Their voices trembled. One insisted he saw something with a wolf's head and a man's stance. John tried to calm them, asserting that no official evidence confirmed such claims. Despite his words, John felt rising unease. Attacks continued at irregular intervals. Guards patrolled in pairs, but that did not deter the beasts. Several ambushes occurred in broad daylight. Wolves seemed disturbingly strategic, circling their prey and striking from behind. John noted that victims were often isolated or distracted. Late one afternoon, John joined a patrol that ventured into a wooded area a quarter-mile from the base. They followed fresh tracks across shallow snowdrifts. The trail ended by a narrow creek. The howling wind obscured distant sounds. Suddenly they heard snarls echoing among the pines. The patrol took positions, rifles raised. No wolves emerged, yet unsettling growls seemed to emanate from multiple directions. After several tense minutes, the noises ceased. The patrol withdrew uneventfully. Back at camp, John proposed an updated defense plan. He organized rotating watch shifts to ensure coverage at every hour. He also requested motion-activated floodlights to discourage nocturnal intrusions. These precautions offered minimal reassurance to weary workers. Some individuals threatened to abandon the project. Henry intervened, reminding them of contractual obligations and government confidentiality. Morale declined further. Tension intensified when a terrified watchman reported seeing a wolf-like silhouette loping on two legs before dropping onto all fours. Soldiers doubted his account, but he insisted he was sober and alert. Henry asked John to investigate. John examined footprints found in the snow. They were strange and disjointed, as though an animal had shifted gait mid-stride. The rumor spread fast. Civilians began calling them werewolves. John tried to dismiss that notion, but the repeated sightings and unusual footprints rattled everyone. Bradley admitted privately that local legends spoke of cursed guardians able to switch forms. He emphasized that such tales were never verified by science. But John sensed uncertainty behind Bradley's explanation. Determined to fight back, John devised new traps that extended beyond the perimeter. He requested tripwire systems linked to flares, hoping bright light would confuse approaching packs. Soldiers deployed these devices around critical areas: storage tents, sleeping quarters, and the entrance to the excavation site. John worked long hours overseeing the operation. Yet attacks continued, seemingly undeterred. Some traps were triggered without catching anything. One evening, a guard post reported hearing heavy breathing just beyond the floodlights. By the time reinforcements arrived, the area was empty. Concern spiraled into panic when bodies started turning up during daylight hours. Workers quit en masse. Henry scrambled to contain the chaos. In desperation, John gathered volunteers for a new expedition. He wanted to confirm if these wolves were natural or something else. Civilians pleaded for more guards on every shift. The entire camp braced for another night of terror. Uncertain and angry, John gripped his rifle and prepared for the worst. The notion of werewolves felt impossible, yet the evidence suggested no ordinary threat. A silent dread swallowed morale as the sun set on another frigid day. In the twilight, John stared at the perimeter, determined. Word spread to higher authorities that the situation on the Alaskan base was spiraling. Within days, a fresh squad of military personnel arrived, each skilled in advanced hunting tactics. They carried specialized rifles, night vision scopes, and equipment meant for tracking elusive predators. Their leader, Lieutenant Monroe, offered John a curt greeting before requesting a detailed briefing. John outlined the pattern of attacks, emphasizing that these wolves displayed abnormal cunning. Monroe listened calmly, then informed John they would evaluate the terrain and begin a structured hunt. Henry joined the meeting, although he had avoided direct combat until now. His demeanor shifted. He appeared more decisive. He told Monroe that earlier attempts to cull the wolves failed because they moved in unpredictable patterns. Monroe responded that his team specialized in controlling dangerous wildlife. John mentioned seeing footprints larger than expected, but Monroe brushed it aside as a quirk of Arctic conditions. That afternoon, Henry accompanied Monroe's men and John on a scouting mission. They traversed the perimeter, investigating sites where attacks occurred. One soldier inspected tufts of fur clinging to a jagged post. Another examined claw marks scored into frozen crates. Monroe noted the unusual severity of these signs. He concluded that these wolves did not kill for food alone. John confirmed that many victims were found only partially eaten or not consumed at all. At dusk, Henry called John aside. He looked uneasy. In a low voice, he revealed that the attacks had started months before John's arrival. The first expedition encountered these predators while surveying the site for rare materials. Several men were killed, but upper management suppressed the information. Henry admitted he had cooperated with the secrecy to keep funding intact. John felt betrayed, angry that Henry withheld critical facts. However, Henry insisted he feared losing support if the government deemed the mission too dangerous. Meanwhile, Monroe's squad prepared to launch a nighttime assault on suspected wolf dens. John joined them, feeling compelled to see matters through. Henry, though hesitant, also agreed to participate. He carried a rifle and wore a determined expression. The group advanced in formation, scanning the snowy terrain with infrared goggles. They detected faint heat signatures near a rocky escarpment. Monroe signaled to fan out. Suddenly, shapes darted across the field of vision. Muzzles glinted in the moonlight. Rifle fire erupted. A soldier yelled, pointing to a group of wolves sprinting at uncanny speeds. Henry fired twice, striking one creature. It tumbled, snarled, and fled. Monroe ordered a pursuit, but the remaining predators retreated into the darkness. John searched the scene, finding spent casings and sparse drops of blood. He felt frustration rising. The squad regrouped. Monroe cursed under his breath, stunned by the wolves' apparent tactics. They had avoided the brunt of gunfire, using cover and speed to escape. Henry appeared shaken, as though he regretted not exposing the danger sooner. John confronted Henry once they returned to camp. "You should have warned us from the start." Henry muttered a brief apology. He claimed he was trying to protect the project's future. Over the next morning, Monroe debriefed everyone. He admitted this threat was unlike any standard wolf encounter. The creatures moved with deliberate coordination. Civilians grew more frightened, especially after learning these hunts had been ongoing for far longer than reported. John addressed the workforce, stating they had reinforcements and better weapons now. He tried reassuring them that success was possible if they remained vigilant. Henry doubled patrol shifts, assigning extra guards around the clock. The camp resembled a fortress under siege. Tents stood in orderly rows, each ringed by barriers and guarded by armed soldiers. John recognized the grim determination in everyone's eyes. Fear lingered, but nobody intended to abandon the job outright. The government demanded results, and these men and women were bound by classified obligations. As darkness fell, the perimeter lights flared to life. The new security teams hoped to pin down the wolves with concentrated gunfire. John lingered near a watchtower, rifle in hand. The men beside him scanned the open tundra. Henry paced, occasionally pausing to peer into the distance. Everyone expected another attack. The tension was suffocating, though no one uttered a complaint. The defensive lines were drawn, and the next encounter felt imminent. Henry swallowed hard, gripped his rifle, and stared into the shadows. Nobody knew what horrors waited out there. They braced themselves, uncertain whether cunning animals or something worse lay ahead. When midnight arrived without incident, relief flickered briefly. Then a distant howl shattered John, and Lieutenant Monroe devised a plan to strike back decisively. They would dig concealed pits, line them with sharpened stakes, and position armed men inside hidden trenches. The objective involved luring the wolves toward these traps using recorded howls and artificial prey calls. The soldiers labeled this method a dual strategy: hunt with calls and hunt from concealment. They hoped to exploit standard wolf instincts, drawing the pack into a kill zone. John reviewed the layout. Stakes were carefully placed at the bottom of each pit. Thick ropes supported a flimsy covering of branches and snow. Nearby, men crouched, rifles trained on possible entry routes. If the wolves approached from the expected angle, they would be trapped or shot. Monroe circulated among the soldiers, checking equipment and reminding them to hold fire until the animals were in range. Henry sat in one trench, gripping his rifle and breathing quickly. The night sky stretched above, devoid of cloud cover. A bitter wind rattled the sparse foliage. John gave the signal. A soldier activated the recorded howls, letting them resonate through the frigid air. After a tense wait, distant replies echoed. The plan seemed to be working. Heartbeats quickened. Rifles steadied against shoulders. John peered over the trench rim, scanning the dark expanse. Several minutes later, movement flickered at the edge of visibility. Shadows shifted. Monroe raised a hand, signaling caution. The wolves emerged slowly, sniffing the air. John counted 4, possibly 5. They advanced on all fours, low to the ground. One stepped onto the covering of the nearest pit. It held still, ears perked, as though sensing danger. John waited, finger on the trigger. Without warning, another group of wolves charged from behind, attacking the trenches from an unexpected angle. Gunshots rang out as startled men spun to defend themselves. Several predators leaped over the protective barriers, snapping at those inside. A soldier screamed when a wolf tore into his shoulder. John turned and fired, striking one beast that had clamped onto a trapped man. Chaos enveloped the scene. Meanwhile, the wolves near the pits darted away, avoiding the trap entirely. Monroe shouted for regroup, but the frantic melee made coordination difficult. Henry emerged from his trench, nearly colliding with a lunging wolf. He raised his rifle, squeezed the trigger, and wounded the creature's flank. It stumbled, but still snapped at him. Henry tripped, narrowly escaping the creature's jaws as another shot from a soldier forced it back. In the confusion, John saw a wolf silhouetted by faint moonlight. It stood upright for an instant, then dropped to 4 legs and vanished into swirling snow. He felt a chill run through him. The rumored half-human posture seemed real, not a rumor after all. When the frenzy subsided, 2 soldiers lay wounded and 1 was missing. The ambush plan had failed. Henry inspected the broken traps, despair etched across his features. Monroe looked furious, wiping blood from a shallow cut on his arm. "These things are toying with us," he growled. John stood near him, scanning the darkness for any sign of further attacks. At dawn, they tallied the damage. Defensive positions were compromised, morale plummeted. Rumors of werewolves circulated freely now, with some workers convinced they had seen beasts walking like men. Henry admitted to John that he believed the local legends. He recalled tribal elders who warned outsiders never to occupy these grounds. "I wanted to protect everyone," he whispered. "I failed." John asked Monroe about next steps. Monroe said they would regroup and request additional assets. However, radio communication had grown sporadic, hampered by weather or possible sabotage. John suspected something else was at play. The possibility of a traitor lurking in camp gnawed at him, though he had no proof. The entire situation felt grim. By midday, the wounded received care, but the missing soldier never turned up. Blood trails suggested he had been dragged off. Despair tightened its grip on the personnel. The elaborate plan had collapsed, and the wolves, or perhaps werewolves, seemed unbeatable. Even the specialized hunters looked shaken. John walked through camp, observing exhausted faces. Henry lingered near the damaged traps, refusing to speak further. That evening, John tried rallying the remainder of the hunters, reminding them they still had weapons and manpower. "We can't let them dominate us," he said. Some listened, but many were too demoralized to respond. As darkness crept in, the air thickened with dread. The base braced once again, hoping the night would pass without another onslaught. John Grant stood outside the main construction tent, watching workers abandon their posts one by one. The shortage of volunteers had reached a critical point. Wooden crates sat half unloaded near idle vehicles, and partially assembled support beams remained scattered across the frosty ground. Armed guards hovered near the perimeter, but even they appeared uneasy. Every new night brought fresh bloodshed, and nobody felt safe. Construction halted completely, robbing the mission of any progress. Henry, usually busy organizing schedules, paced near a stack of frozen lumber. His expression displayed tension. Several workers had confronted him an hour earlier, refusing to continue until the base was fully secured. He could not promise protection. The boldness of the attacking wolves had escalated. They bypassed floodlights, avoided tripwire alarms, and slipped into tents. People cowered behind locked doors or flimsy barriers, but none of that stopped the marauders. Bradley, the lead scientist, moved between the frightened civilians, pleading for calm. His requests fell on deaf ears. Whispers about shape-shifting predators became prevalent. Some claimed to see large wolves walking on their hind legs, easily breaching defenses. Others talked about strange symbols carved into trees near the camp's edge. John doubted that rumor, but panic swelled. Several men said they would rather desert the mission than die. One night, around midnight, the base was hit again. Wolves tore through the barricades. Gunfire echoed across the compound. Screams reverberated in narrow passages between tents. Soldiers sprinted in random directions, trying to regroup under swirling snow. When dawn arrived, the bodies of 2 technicians were discovered inside the communications module. Thick claw marks tore across metallic panels. Nobody understood how these animals bypassed multiple guards, but the result was indisputable. The survivors huddled in a large storage tent, struggling to contain their fear. John tried to deliver a briefing explaining that the hunt would continue, but desperation was evident. Morale had collapsed, and discipline wore thin. He recognized that people craved reassurance, yet he had none to offer. Even soldiers with extensive combat backgrounds admitted these assailants behaved unlike normal wolves. Their movement patterns defied ordinary logic, and they possessed unnatural cunning. Henry approached John after the makeshift meeting. He revealed that each day felt like a countdown to further tragedy. John attempted to reassure him that reinforcements might arrive soon, but Henry's eyes shifted anxiously. Nobody trusted that claim, especially since communication systems had just failed. Repeated attempts to contact higher command resulted in static. Henry pointed toward the damaged antenna rig, noticing severed wiring. Sabotage appeared likely. Bradley later confirmed that the base's primary communication array had been deliberately destroyed. Somebody snuck onto the roof of the equipment shed and sliced cables, possibly with specialized tools. Bradley suspected an insider since the infiltration required intimate knowledge of the security layout. John shared this suspicion. The question was, who would commit such treason? Shortly afterward, the few functioning radios ceased transmitting. Electrical surges blew out backup circuits. John directed a small team to investigate, but they found only more sabotage. Generators had been tampered with in ways that indicated purposeful knowledge of electrical engineering. Under normal circumstances, Henry would have demanded an internal investigation, but the immediate danger overshadowed everything else. The nighttime attacks continued with deadly precision. Multiple squads reported shadowy figures slipping through the wire fences. Civilians refused to leave their bunks. Some collapsed from terror after hearing howls inches from their tent walls. The base turned into a place of constant dread. Work stopped altogether, and the once urgent schedule for completing the underground tunnel became meaningless. John felt certain that if the tunnel remained unfinished, the mission would fail. Yet survival mattered more. Henry confided in John that he doubted their ability to eliminate these creatures. His belief that they were ordinary wolves had vanished. He now spoke about old legends that Bradley mentioned weeks earlier. John realized his own skepticism had softened. The evidence suggested something far beyond normal predators. Reports of half-wolf figures standing upright convinced him that folklore might be relevant. Late one evening, John and Henry stood on a collapsed structure near the perimeter. They surveyed the stormy darkness, weapons held ready. Neither man spoke for a while. Eventually, Henry admitted he had no idea how to restore the communications equipment without specialized parts. John suspected a saboteur was working with the attacking wolves. Whether a person or something else, the culprit had ensured no help would arrive. Within that silent admission, they felt the crushing weight of isolation. They listened for howls, braced for the next onslaught, and silently wondered which of them would survive another night in that forsaken place. Henry locked himself inside his tent on a particularly dark night, clutching a flashlight and a loaded rifle. Nearby, wind rustled the canvas walls, creating a subtle sense of confinement. Outside, roving patrols attempted to secure the camp, though few trusted that any measure would suffice. Night after night, the attackers grew bolder. Their methods transcended typical animal behavior, and grim discoveries multiplied in the morning light. Shortly before midnight, distant gunfire erupted. Henry heard startled shouts near the southern perimeter. He froze, contemplating whether to leave the safety of his shelter. But frantic screams intensified. He realized the wolves had entered the compound again. Heart-pounding, he peered through a narrow opening in the tent. Shapes darted between low-light fixtures. At least 5 wolves sprinted across the camp, but Henry noticed 3 additional shapes not entirely on 4 legs. With trembling hands, he unzipped the tent flap. He spotted one large wolf, bounding toward his position. Then it stopped abruptly. The animal raised its body, shifting from all 4s onto hind legs. Henry saw muscular limbs and elongated claws. Its head twisted in an unnatural manner, revealing fierce eyes. 2 more wolves advanced, similarly altering their stance. Henry realized in that instant that these creatures were indeed werewolves. One of them let out a chilling sound, somewhere between a snarl and a human shout. Henry remembered a promise he had once made. He recalled a past encounter when he had first come to these lands with an earlier group. Back then, he had vowed he would not bring more people. He had bargained for his life, swearing he would keep the secret hidden. He had lied. He frantically admitted his betrayal to the werewolves. His words tumbled out, describing how he sabotaged communications to prevent further arrivals. He claimed he was loyal, that he wanted no additional intrusions on sacred land. He begged them to spare him and eliminate everyone else, if that was their wish. He no longer cared about the mission's success, only his own survival. The 3 werewolves advanced, ignoring his attempt at submission. Henry raised his rifle and managed to fire twice at the nearest one. The shots barely slowed it. The creature lunged forward, striking Henry's weapon with enough force to knock it aside. He scrambled backward, falling onto an overturned crate. Claws raked across his arm, drawing blood. He shouted that he was still an ally, but the werewolves continued their assault, displaying no mercy. Outside, muffled voices tried to coordinate a defense. Sporadic gunfire echoed, but the night's confusion made it impossible to form a proper rescue. Henry wrestled with one werewolf, trying to push away its snapping jaws. His strength paled before the creature's power. Another beast circled behind him, its low growl vibrating through the frigid air. Henry understood he was trapped. He screamed for help, but the nearest soldiers were engaged elsewhere. Within moments, the tent collapsed under the weight of multiple bodies. Henry felt jaws clamp around his shoulder. Pain tore through him, and he swung wildly with a hunting knife. A werewolf roared in annoyance, then raked him with savage claws. Henry's thoughts scattered. He realized he had unleashed these horrors upon his own people. He had enabled their relentless offensive. He pleaded once more, promising anything, but his words vanished into the chaos. The silhouettes of the beasts shifted again, returning to a shape closer to ordinary wolves. They dragged Henry's broken form across the scattered debris, as though savoring the kill. His cries faded, and final darkness overtook him. At dawn, John and a handful of surviving soldiers stumbled upon the gruesome remains outside the collapsed tent. The body was torn in multiple places, impossible to identify at first glance. Tattered clothes indicated it was Henry. Blood smeared across the frozen ground. Wolf prints surrounded the site, along with footprints suggesting partially upright movement. John stared, his mind churning with anger and sorrow. A few men stepped away, unable to stomach the scene. Others watched silently, guns at the ready, scanning for further threats. John crouched near Henry's body, recognizing the face of a man who once oversaw this base. Though the remains were badly mutilated, certain details left no doubt. John examined the tracks, noticing patterns that hinted the creatures had toyed with Henry's final moments. In that realization, John knew the horror had only intensified. Grief lingered over the camp, yet John Grant had no time to mourn. Henry's death left a void in leadership, forcing John to assume overall coordination. With communications down and the team shaken, he understood drastic measures were required. He recalled old folklore about silver bullets, a detail often dismissed as myth. Now it seemed worth exploring. John scavenged the base, searching for any traces of silver. A few small bars were stored among supplies slated for laboratory experiments. Some soldiers remembered decorative silverware stashed in crates for a planned mess hall. John collected everything that contained enough silver content, then commandeered a makeshift workshop near the generator shed. He melted down the metal, forging it into crude bullet tips. The quantity was limited, but he hoped it would suffice for a few magazines. Bradley helped with the process, handling the smelting equipment under John's instructions. He questioned whether this plan would truly work, but John insisted they had no other viable option. The men around them seemed desperate enough to believe. Once the bullets hardened, John organized the defenders, distributing the specialized ammunition to those most able to keep calm in a crisis. He kept several silver rounds for himself. After preparing the weapons, John instructed everyone to fortify the center of the camp. They moved tents and storage crates, creating barricades. Access paths were stacked with debris, forcing any intruder to cross open ground under watchful eyes. Makeshift watchtowers were erected using steel beams originally intended for the unfinished tunnel. The men stood guard, scanning the horizon with binoculars and night vision scopes. Knowing the werewolves possessed unusual intelligence, John devised a plan that leveraged himself as bait. He had studied the creatures' behavior and noticed their particular interest in direct confrontation. They seemed driven by a desire to target perceived threats. He wrapped a bandage around a small cut on his arm, allowing fresh blood to drip. He reasoned that the scent might lure them closer. At twilight, the personnel assembled behind barricades. Gunmen took positions with rifles loaded. John stationed himself near an exposed stretch of ground, well lit by portable floodlights. Bradley crouched in a protected spot 50 yards away, monitoring the perimeter. Tension built as darkness spread. The cold air stung their faces and muffled breathing underscored the silence. Hours passed without incident. Then a distant howl broke the stillness. The watchers tensed. John steadied his rifle, ensuring his first shots would be silver rounds. Movement flickered on the far edge of the camp. Wolves emerged, their eyes reflecting an eerie glow under the floodlights. At least 4 advanced slowly, testing the defenses. Gunfire erupted. 1 wolf fell, but 3 scattered into the shadows. Seconds later they reappeared on the flank. John spun, spotting them circling a barricade. Soldiers opened fire, striking one in the shoulder. It snarled and retreated behind a half-collapsed tent. A new shape materialized from the darkness, taller and broader than the rest. Its posture was somewhere between human and wolf, with elongated limbs and powerful claws. Chaos ensued. The werewolf lunged forward, smashing through a pile of crates that served as a barrier. Several defenders fired in unison, but conventional bullets had little effect. The creature roared and sliced through 2 soldiers. John aimed carefully, exhaling to steady his hands. He pulled the trigger, sending a silver round into the werewolf's chest. The impact halted its advance, and it staggered. Foam dripped from its jaws as it launched itself at John. John managed a second shot, burying another silver bullet in the monster's side. It collapsed in front of him. He stepped closer, heart pounding. The werewolf twitched, emitting a guttural sound that resonated with unnatural intensity. John placed his rifle barrel against its heart and squeezed the trigger one last time. The final silver round ended the creature's life. He stood over the corpse, noting its terrifying features. It was larger than a standard wolf, with broad shoulders and massive teeth. The eyes remained open, reflecting unrelenting fury even in death. Around him, gunfire persisted as other wolves attacked. Soldiers fell, and some retreated behind barricades. The stench of blood and gunpowder permeated the air. John felt a surge of grim resolve. They had proven that silver could kill a werewolf, but the cost was steep. The base fell into a grim rhythm of constant vigilance. After the lethal skirmish, John Grant and the survivors braced for the possibility of an even fiercer counterattack. They had wounded and likely killed one of the pack's dominant werewolves. If these creatures possessed the capacity for vengeance, John expected the fallout to be brutal. A few hours past midnight, the camp's spotlights flickered in the icy wind. Soldiers, engineers, and civilian workers huddled behind fortifications. All normal duties were abandoned. The entire settlement focused on survival. John patrolled the barricades, offering terse encouragement to the defenders. The men checked their limited stash of silver rounds, knowing each bullet was precious. Conventional ammunition seemed to have little effect on the main threats. Shortly before dawn, movement appeared near the southwestern perimeter. Several watchers reported seeing shapes approach. At first, no alarm was raised because the forms were scattered, as if only a few wolves prowled. Then a thunderous roar echoed across the compound. The assault began. At least 6 werewolves charged from multiple directions, with normal wolves in support. They moved without subtlety or cunning, relying on sheer aggression. Gunfire exploded across the base. The defenders fired flares to illuminate the onslaught. Muzzle flashes revealed werewolves leaping over crates and colliding with armed personnel. Silver bullets were discharged sporadically, but the confusion made precise aim difficult. John rushed to regroup a squad that had become isolated near the half-built tunnel entrance. He signaled them to fall back into a narrower passage where overlapping fields of fire might hold the attackers at bay. The creatures surged relentlessly. 2 soldiers disappeared under slashing claws before the rest could drag them away. Terrified screams resonated in narrow corridors formed by piled construction materials. John realized the creatures had abandoned their earlier tactics. This was raw fury, unleashed in retaliation for their fallen member. With the southwestern perimeter breached, John decided to lead the defenders inside the incomplete underground tunnel. The opening gaped behind a row of heavy machinery. He shouted for everyone to retreat into that corridor. The space was partially reinforced with steel supports, but the walls and ceiling remained rough. Equipment lay scattered across the floor, and overhead lights flickered from unstable power lines. The tunnel provided limited cover, yet it forced the werewolves to funnel into a confined passage. John ushered people inside, then ordered them to form a defensive line. Shots rang out as the attackers followed. A large werewolf lunged into the mouth of the tunnel, its jaws snapping at the closest soldier. John fired 2 silver rounds, grazing its shoulder and forcing it to recoil. Another beast darted behind it, snarling in frustration. Wolves howled from outside, pacing with impatience. The defenders inched backward through the tunnel, luring the creatures deeper underground. Sparks showered from dangling wires each time gunfire rattled the corridor. One of the werewolves barreled through a half-assembled partition, scattering tools. Several men concentrated their fire, landing silver shots that wounded it badly. The creature staggered, then collapsed against a metal beam. Moments later, it let out a final breath. Yet 3 more advanced, each with injuries that did not impede their rage. They cornered a small group of defenders near a partially set demolition charge. John realized an opportunity. He and the others directed suppressive fire, herding the beasts near the explosives that had been installed to clear rock during the tunnel's construction. Another soldier placed additional charges along the chamber walls. The defenders withdrew as John gave the signal. They ignited the explosives, sending a tremor through the entire structure. Thick dust and shattered rock cascaded from the ceiling, engulfing the werewolves that remained within. Thunderous echoes rippled through the corridor, and the floor shook. The collapse sealed the tunnel, burying anything inside under a massive load of rubble. The few surviving defenders stumbled out of the entrance, coughing from the dust. They regrouped in the open, trying to calm their nerves. Silence settled over the area. The howling outside the tunnel ceased. John and several others exchanged weary glances, uncertain whether any creatures had survived. But the destruction was thorough, likely entombing every attacker in that subterranean vault of stone and debris. They stood amid the wreckage, battered and disoriented, unsure if they had truly won. The camp was ravaged, and the living were few. John felt no triumph, only a grim realization that the immediate threat might be over. He exhaled, scanning the rubble for any sign of movement. Daylight brought a semblance of calm. The wolves that had once prowled the perimeter seemed to vanish after the tunnel's collapse. John Grant and the remaining personnel walked the grounds, assessing the devastation. Tents lay torn, supplies were scattered, and the bodies of fallen soldiers and workers awaited identification. A few men gathered near a makeshift medical station to treat the wounded. Everyone felt relief mingled with grief. Later that same day, a convoy of government vehicles arrived unannounced. They had navigated the rough wilderness track without prior communication, apparently sent in response to partial distress signals. Armed agents stepped out, surveying the wreckage with sharp focus. Their leader produced official documents authorizing a broad investigation. They recorded the structural damage, the remains of unusual wolves, and the broken communications equipment. John answered questions, summarizing the attacks and the measures taken. New workers disembarked from trucks, wearing thick jackets and looking wary of their surroundings. Some had engineering experience, others were scientists, and a contingent of fresh military personnel formed a security detail. Orders directed them to resume extraction of the volatile substance, reinforcing the base with improved fortifications. Government interest in the underground resource had not waned. If anything, it had intensified. John observed their arrival with mixed emotions. He recognized that the mission would continue regardless of past horrors. Funding and political pressure demanded results. Teams began clearing debris almost immediately, erecting new tents, and repairing essential infrastructure. The noise of heavy machinery replaced the menacing quiet of the prior days. Despite lingering fear, the newcomers faced deadlines. John found himself answering logistical questions while he was still processing the events that nearly destroyed them. One morning, 2 soldiers approached John with orders from higher authorities. They stated he was being named acting head of the operation. His record of leadership during the crisis had apparently impressed the chain of command. They wanted someone on site who understood the situation intimately. John read the official papers and quietly accepted. His new role included coordinating tunnel reconstruction, managing base security, and finalizing the extraction plan. Repair of the communication systems moved forward under the watchful eye of the new technicians. Within a few days, stable contact was re-established with outside command. Helicopters flew in additional supplies and personnel. The camp took on a more permanent appearance, with steel-reinforced buildings replacing temporary tents. John attended briefing sessions where government officials examined every detail of the attacks, though they seemed less concerned about local legends. Official reports labeled the adversaries as large predatory animals, leaving no room for more supernatural interpretations. Meanwhile, construction on the deeper levels advanced. Crews resumed drilling to reach the volatile ore. Military patrols guarded every entrance, ensuring no more surprises emerged from the surrounding wilderness. Sentries reported occasional distant howls, but no attacks materialized. It seemed the threat had receded, likely destroyed in the tunnel collapse. Workers felt safer, though uneasy memories of savage nights remained. John's days became consumed with administrative tasks. At night, he walked alone through the newly erected corridors. The constant clanking of machines carried on even after sunset, a testament to the unrelenting push to finish the project. The base expanded rapidly. Official visitors arrived for inspections and left without revealing what they truly believed about past events. Near the end of one long shift, John retreated to his modest office in a completed wing of the main building. A single lamp illuminated his desk, cluttered with blueprints for an advanced tunnel design. On the wall behind him hung the hide of the werewolf he had shot with silver bullets. Its glare, frozen in death, reminded him of the night he confronted a legend made real. He sipped a mug of coffee, unable to ignore the chilling memory. He heard the distant rumble of vehicles transporting ore samples. Outside, floodlights bathed the site in a harsh glow. It was well past midnight, but the new crews worked in shifts around the clock. The schedule permitted no delays. John flipped through engineering diagrams verifying measurements for the next phase of construction. Suddenly, an unnerving cry reverberated through the corridor. It was not a simple echo of machinery. It carried the raw intensity of a primal snarl. Alarm sounded. Soldiers outside the office shouted warnings. John stood abruptly, clutching his sidearm. The hide on the wall seemed to stare at him. he realized that the horrors he thought buried might not be gone after all.